Okay, so I'm going to talk about pushing the boundaries, critical research into higher education. And I've chosen the metaphor of pushing at boundaries of research into higher education to suggest that I think the boundaries of research are too narrowly drawn and that we're not asking sufficiently challenging questions. Boundaries help to define, but can also limit. Extending boundaries, therefore, implies pushing them back. I've used extending rather than crossing because that might imply leaving the territory. I want to suggest interrogating the complexities of higher education involves being in multiple places and is a space where we can ask critical questions. My definition of research into higher education is very broad. It covers that work that can be described as being about higher education, as well as work that is for higher education, in the narrower sense of research into improvement, whether this is understood as making things better for students or making higher education more productive. The aim of research into higher education for me is to come to an understanding of higher education, to ask difficult questions and not simply about what works. Although the what works questions can be important, we're likely to be seriously misled unless the grounds of asking are properly understood and theorized. Moreover, because we are insiders, researching into higher education presents us with particular problems in moving beyond our everyday lived common sense. Posing critical questions involves noticing the oddities of the field, observing and questioning the rules of the game. And this involves establishing a certain distance between us and our research subject. In his study of academic life, Homo Academicus, the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu argues, the sociologist who chooses to study, and it is his own world, in its nearest and most familiar aspects, should not, as the ethnologist would, domesticate the exotic, but exoticize the domestic through a break with his initial relation of intimacy. In other words, we need to make the familiar unfamiliar and to ask questions about what is specific to the field of higher education itself. Bourdieu's domestic metaphor is telling, because when women began to interrogate the domestic, whole new fields of feminist inquiry were opened up. Similarly, Edward Said's monumental study of Orientalism, first published in 1978, challenged our notions of the exotic. So to make our own familiar settings exotic is a way to render them other. For example, Lisa Lucas, in her book, The Research Game in Academic Life, shows how the relatively recent game of research selectivity is widening status distinctions both between universities and also within them, often to the detriment of both students and academics alike. I want to suggest, therefore, that we need to question not just old ideas and hierarchies, but also to look at some of the newer practices and newer orthodoxies, and especially ones, and perhaps like the idea of the student voice, that we've become attached to. And I want to argue that in order to do this, we need a more extended theoretical and critical vocabulary. So my address, therefore, falls into three main parts. In the first, I hazard some general observations and ask questions about the field and consider the theoretical resources available to higher education researchers. In the second, I turn to some of the sorts of questions we ask and take some examples from my own research and use this to trouble the idea of the student voice. And in the final part, you'll be pleased to know, I want to suggest some reasons to be cheerful. Theoretical resources. Theory has an odd and unsettled relationship in debates about teaching and learning. It has recently resurfaced in the debates about the scholarship of teaching and learning and has been criticised most notably by Graham Gibbs as lacking in sophistication and knowledge of previously published work. His challenge has produced much soul-searching, but also some sophisticated responses, including from Pat Hutchinson and Mary Huber, who reject the notion of theory in the singular. Problems remain, however. Malcolm Tite reviewed the published literature outside North America under the headings of teaching and learning, course design, and the student experience, and found that only a third showed any evidence of engagement with theoretical resources. This is a remarkable absence. Given the complexities of higher education systems, the characteristics of students, the multiple processes of higher education, and the numbers of questions that can be asked about student learning, it seems highly unlikely that any one form of theory will suffice, or indeed any singular verification strategy. Indeed, the sorts of questions we ask are shaped by our theoretical starting points. Now, much of the early research into higher education emerged, not surprisingly, out of a concern with the learning experiences of students. A dominant tradition of research evolved, which became known as the approaches to learning and teaching perspective, based on phenomenographic studies of how students and teachers experience particular phenomena. Much of this work focused on students' intentions to learn, and conceptions such as deep and surface learning by starting from qualitative data. The approach has been so influential that Mike Prosser and Keith Trigwell were able to claim that the combination of evidence that, on the one hand, a deep approach to learning is desirable and a surface approach is less desirable, and on the other hand, the learning context, and in some cases student perceptions, can be changed by university teachers and administrators to afford one or other approach, forms the basis of a powerful tool to improve the quality of students' learning. And even more simply, Noel Entwistle to state that increasingly this research is indicating ways of improving teaching in higher education in ways which directly affect the quality of student learning. And I'm sure lots of you will be really familiar with this trend in research. It's also inspired phenomenographic inquiries into other aspects of higher education and has proved immensely popular with practitioners. In terms of its theoretical resources, however, this approach is limited in the numbers of questions it asks. Crucially, from my perspective, the focus on conceptions of learning and teaching neglects all the broader social questions we might want to ask of higher education systems and higher education itself. These systems are constantly in flux and reshape what it means to be an academic, and indeed the nature of studentship itself. Numerous writers have pointed to the ways in which the idea of studentship is being subtly transformed from one who studied texts, studentship in a discipline, to the idea of studentship as the production of autonomous, self-directed, flexible, lifelong learners, and also, of course, as we all know, increasingly as consumers. Indeed, the whole policy discourse of higher education is now encapsulated in terms like employability, or in the Australasian context, graduate attributes. These configurations shift what counts as knowledge and how it is judged. Indeed, they are, as Erica McWilliam notes, changing the subject of higher education. And as McWilliam rather wickedly notes, rather than academics having a relationship to their own work or with students, what increasingly counts is the degree of intimacy that academics have with the record. And I'm sure if many of you have spent time filling in forms and so on, this will have a resonance, the intimacy with the record. Now, understanding these sorts of trends makes the question of the resources for theorizing even more compelling. And one example of how this is being addressed is an important book by Paul Ashwin. He has made the case for extending the repertoire of theoretical resources brought to bear analysing teaching and learning interactions in higher education, and shows by drawing on different theories, and he gives examples of activity theory and symbolic interactionism, we can highlight different aspects of the teaching-learning relationship. He draws on the work of Basil Bernstein, for example, to highlight the ways disciplinary knowledge practices are transformed into curriculum, and to highlight the distinction between discipline as research, discipline as curriculum, and as pedagogic practice. Now, this sort of approach, I would suggest, might produce a much more sophisticated take on the debates about research and teaching. For example, by recognizing the ways in which there are real distinctions between the two and looking at the hierarchies involved in the translation process. Ashwin also argues we can use Bourdieu's concept of field and habitus to illustrate the origins of different institutional cultures. And of course, Diane Ray and her colleagues have used Bourdieu to analyse and deconstruct the idea of student choice, and more recently in her work with Jill Crozier, to look at how the habitus of different institutions supports or inhibits the development of students' social and learning identities. Ashwin emphasises that different theoretical framings extend the range of questions, and also that empirical research in turn poses challenges for how we develop theory. So neither his nor my argument is for some overarching theoretical synthesis, but rather for pushing at boundaries and acknowledging that different theoretical perspectives will illuminate different problems. So, the questions we ask. So what I want to turn to is the sorts of questions we ask. And here I want to draw a little bit on my own work, where I've taken seemingly mundane and ordinary practices in higher education and asked both theoretical and empirical questions about them. My local examples have some characteristics specific to the UK, but the overall theoretical argument and tendencies they would describe, I suggest, do not. Although I, like many others, have analysed what might seem like perverse developments in higher education, such as managerialism, what I'm increasingly interested in are the contradictions within what seem like progressive moves, you know, the things that are dear to the hearts of the people here, to us, and the way some problems come to dominate our agendas and not others. So the example I'm going to use is research into personal development planning, which attempts to improve learning for students by helping them to reflect. Personal development planning, what's called self-regulation in the North American literature, covers a range of practices whereby we ask students to think about what they're doing, to analyse and reflect, and then plan future actions in order to improve their learning. Now, there's a level at which this seems such an obviously good and sensible thing that it hardly merits attention. It's one of those common senses, you know, the rules of the game, it just is such an obviously good thing. But I was intrigued, however, for a number of reasons. Firstly, because in the UK it has been implemented across the sector, across the whole sector, and across indeed all levels, from first year undergraduate right through to doctoral level. The only pedagogical technology which is mandated by the Quality Assurance Agency. Secondly, because it has attracted a flurry of interest around the question of what works, leading to the commissioning of the first systematic review of the literature in the higher education field. And I know there are a lot of people from health in the audience, and you will be very familiar with the debates about evidence-based, systematic review, and so you will know the origins of this, and it's sort of spread out from its medical origins. And thirdly, I was interested because in my work with staff in different disciplinary areas, I was very aware of how difficult reflection is, and that, moreover, students fake it, retrospectively writing up what look like reflections, often the very day before they're required to submit them. And yes, you've all had that. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So the impetus for my research was policy-orientated, research-orientated, and practice-based. So when I first started thinking about personal development planning, I rapidly realised it was what Marx calls a chaotic conception. In other words, it seems like a simple unitary thing, but in fact is a complex and analytical incoherent amalgam. So what I did was I looked at the Higher Education Academy Guides to Busy Academics, short how-to-do-it summaries, written by enthusiasts to illustrate the problem, and some of you may have used these. Personal development planning in these covers everything from dissertation preparation, work on CVs, the development of metacognitive competency, reflection in numerous guises, and so on. The list is quite extensive. In other words, personal development planning covers a whole range of activities. Now, of course, if one's thinking as a practitioner, all this makes perfect sense. The repertoire of strategies one might use in the classroom to engage our students is likely to vary by discipline and orientation. As an object of research about what works, however, this lack of clarity and conceptual precision leaves a lot to be desired. Put simply, in the case of personal development planning, starting with the concretely deceptive simple question, does it work, is unlikely to be amenable to sensible analysis because we don't know what the it is. So the systematic review, which was very thorough, which concluded that personal development planning has positive effects on student learning, student attainment, and approaches to learning, is not especially helpful, since it also concluded that it was not possible to know how or why personal development planning was producing those effects reported. And the problem with programme evaluations is they tend to find that some things work in some circumstances and not in others. Practitioners, of course, want to know how and why, because without these insights into what is working, they're left simply with a list of interventions that are unlikely to be replicable in their own context and may or may not produce positive results. So, despite the procedural rigour of the review, it told us very little that is useful to practitioners and offers no theoretical insight into the mechanisms producing the results because the object under scrutiny was not theorised properly in the first place. We do not know whether the reported outcomes were produced by the same or different mechanisms, or even if the term reflection is being used with any consistency. And given cultural variations and the fact that much of the work reviewed was based in the US, it appears extremely unlikely that this is the case. Reflection is used in very different ways in the different international literatures. In contrast, my own work with colleagues, both practitioners, Sally Bradley and Serena Brufton, took a rather different tack, inquiring into how staff and students understood personal development planning. This research, I want to suggest, produced a much more nuanced account of disciplinary orientations and practice. It showed, not surprisingly, that where practitioners had understood models that stemmed from their own practice, and examples in social work, education, health, then personal development planning was, as a pedagogy, was embedded and successful. However, where it was not consonant with the values of the discipline or the profession, there were tensions. And this was not just a matter of personal orientation or disciplinary preference. Personal development planning has increasingly become associated with utilitarian notions of employability. Understandings of pedagogic practice are being reframed in terms of policy, and the discourse of employability shifts ideas about the focuses of higher education onto producing flexible individuals for the labour market. Now, this is absolutely not to say that employment is not a legitimate goal in participation in higher education, but it is to note the way policy can reposition what goes on in higher education. Personal development and reflection has moved from domains where it was a well-understood, embedded, and under the control of knowledgeable practitioners to one where everyone has to be able to demonstrate its place in the curriculum. And I want to suggest that this is what happens when we get particular policies impacting, and that we really need to inquire about what's going on when that move takes place. This shift, I want to suggest, is part of the general issue of a greater internalisation of what's being called the audit culture, Mac Williams' familiarity with the record, being able to record and show that something has taken place, rather than seeing it as something that might be appropriately embedded as part of the pedagogy. Of course, this insistence on demonstrating might have advantages for students and might make, and I use the word advisably, staff aware of what they're doing. But we should pause to think, to ask questions really about what might be lost. An educational practice, reflection, with its roots in all sorts of progressive educational ideas, many of which I would entirely endorse, changes its meaning by becoming the subject of an external and regulatory gaze. The dangers of inauthenticity in this are all too evident. Reflection has become something that we all have to do, what Catherine Ecclestone, as long ago as 1996, described as a mantra. Unsurprisingly then, students in our research described, as I've already suggested, faking it. Producing something that looks like reflection on demand, usually before the tutorial or handing date, and it has to be set producing some pretty awful writing in the process. And I'm sure lots of you have actually looked at students struggling to find a voice that they think, that we think, that's, you know, that they're performing to a script for us. Although it's called reflection and it's meant to be personal. Students' accounts also made us think about how time is experienced and gave us some insights into why students fake it rather than reflect and plan. Students describe their first year as being lived intensely in the present, as any parent or teacher can tell you. Most did not experience the present in terms of the future. So the idea of planning was a very problematic activity for them. So we're asking them to do something often that actually doesn't correspond to their life world. And a lot of our staff in the study, for example, said it's fine with maturer people. You know, it's fine with some sorts of students. But actually 18-year-olds, when they come from school, are not thinking in terms, and this is what the students told us, they don't experience their world in this ways. It was only when the panic set in, sometimes in the second year, and sometimes even more worryingly in their third, and when the future present of actually graduating started to implode into their consciousness, that they retrospectively recognized that planning might have been a good idea. So all the beautiful plans they were producing for their tutors in the first year were often something that was made up. They sat down and they pretended they'd made a plan and that they followed it. But in fact, what they told us was that was not really the case at all. But it seems to me that there is something really interesting about temporality here that we need to be questioning. It's not that students are just being non-compliant or bad. It's that we're asking them to do something that actually feels very strange in their own life world. So what began with my mundane, my very ordinary subject, personal development planning, sent me into an excursion into theoretical deconstruction, a critique of evidence-based policy, a meditation on time, and as latterly with Miriam David, returned me to thinking about different meanings of the personal, and especially the politics of the personal in feminism. Now, this work does not speak directly back to practice at either the pedagogical or policy level, but I want to suggest it can be used as part of the meaning-making against which sensible policy-making might occur. In recognizing diversity and in resisting unitary interpretations, it is also an invitation for practitioners to think about the meanings of time for students and the ways it might be different from our own. And when I did this presentation the first time, I talked about, when it was on the research and personal development planning at a conference, somebody pointed out that a year, I mean, I'm 60, so a year in my life is actually a relatively short amount of time. A year for an 18-year-old is quite different, and the changes that are going on, it's a quite different existential experience. So, to think about research, I wanted to think about this, my own research, and think about a little bit about research into student voice. If we take some of the features from above and relate them to the idea of student voice, we can begin to appreciate the complexity and indeed the impossibility of the concept. It's another chaotic conception, I suggest, and indeed in the singular, a highly ideological one, ripe, it seems to me, for theoretical interrogation. So I'm just going to suggest some of what Erica McWilliam calls the Wiki Questions we might want to think about. The first is about the origin of voice and voicing, which were highly political and to do with previously marginalised groups claiming a voice for themselves. The most obvious example is feminism. Women claimed a voice as a political collective, and that in turn was to transform whole areas in the social sciences and humanities, sparking a chain of historical and other researchers into hidden voices, voices that had not been heard in the curriculum. I did sociology in 1967, and we did a course called Contemporary Britain, and it was all about the doings, unnoticed, of white men. I mean, it was actually, at the time, I couldn't work out why it was so unengaging. But I mean, this is stuff we're talking about in many of our lifetimes. But as soon as the political subject, women, proclaimed its voice, however, women of colour, lesbians, working class women, many others, were quick to point out that the voice involved was particular, often white, middle class and metropolitan. In other words, the singular of a political project led to the articulation of multiple voices and the fracturing of a political, and it has to be said, of any semblance of theoretical unity. Now, if we think about the student voice, the contradictions are even more striking. Voice is not something that students, unlike perhaps in the 1960s, are themselves collectively asserting. Rather, in a period of low levels of student mobilisation, others, reforming academic developers, managers, policymakers, are mobilising the student voice for their own ends. It has even become fashionable at some conferences for selected students to speak as if they represented some sort of authentic voice. And I don't know whether you've ever been in the audience at these, but I never know what I'm meant to be feeling, thinking, or responding to. You know, particular students are sort of, it's as if I was sort of representing women here, and you would realise how completely absurd that would be. Now, in my own work on academic development, I've been intrigued by the way student views get mobilised and reframed. Lynn McAlpine argues that course ratings and psychologically informed research on student learning has tended towards a deficit, teachers need fixing model. So students' views are re-represented for reformist political effect. Now, given the diversity among students, the idea of the student's experience is not only a chaotic conception, it is one that needs to be considered in its concrete historical circumstances. And when, as we know now, that the student as a paying customer has become a familiar trope. But even if we think it's a good idea and a useful corrective to the power of academics to shape the curriculum, listening to student voices and how to capture them remains highly problematic. The evidence-based approach, and the most high profile, is obviously, and this is in the UK, so I apologise to our international visitors, something called the National Student Survey, but it was based on work that was done at the University of Sydney. But as the highly public spat between Paul Ramsden and Lee Harvey exposed, the fitness for purpose of that particular instrument is contested. There are issues about what's being measured, satisfaction or learning, its reliability and validity, Its openness to manipulation in contexts where league tables are a pernicious feature of press coverage of higher education. And all this makes the National Student Survey rightly controversial. So interpreting what students are saying in both pedagogical and research contexts involves an attention to the plurality of voices and the context in which they are speaking and writing. And as I've suggested, reflection as a genre does not ensure authenticity. It also involves performing to a script. And as any of you, and many of you will have here, who have wrestled with even small amounts of qualitative data know, interpreting research data is equally difficult, which is why we need theoretically informed critical work. And indeed, why much more work that attends to the complex relationships between policy, institutional framework, local culture, and the voice of different students is being produced. And I've been looking at the programme here, and I'm sure there'll be many examples of this at the conference. And I think that that's one of the things, is that the importance of critical work, such as being presented at the conference, is to mess up some of these simple assumptions about how we understand the student voice, how we hear it, the nature of student experience, and pays much more attention to diversity and plurality. But I'll mention just one example from the corpus of work produced by Carol Leithwood in her longitudinal survey of students at London Metropolitan University, which, among other findings, pointed to the subtleties of non-traditional students' understandings of support and independence, not as a binary, but as mutually interdependent. She draws on a range of theoretical perspectives in her work, including feminist theory, to question how current pedagogical and institutional practices position different students and are likely to advantage and disadvantage them. And she points out that the idea of independence makes asking for help difficult. Not being independent is seen as being in a state of lack or as being deficient. And indeed, as one of my respondents in a study I did, a white male, older, mature student said, "I've had to swallow my pride." So help seeking was incredibly problematic in terms of his personal identity. Now, the sorts of critical work like Carol's work is not going to produce or deliver easy solutions for either policymakers or practitioners. But as I hope I've made clear, the apparent simplicities of the evidence-based movement won't either. Indeed, because they pretend they do, they're likely to be more dangerous. There is no one-to-one relationship between research and practice, and this is not a unique problem for higher education. In health, in education, people have been wrestling with these issues. Since Schoen wrote his work on the reflective practitioner. So when we think about higher education, we should bring with us some of the sophisticated theoretical understandings from other policy areas and other professions, and engage in some boundary crossing as well as some boundary pushing. And this may involve theoretical borrowings as well as dialogue. And so, in conclusion, I hope I've given a hint of and demonstrated that there are many, and to my mind, interesting questions to be asked about policies and practices that are mundane and ordinary. And I also want to suggest on the basis of this that there are some reasons to be cheerful, as I suggested. The complexities I've indicated above and the range of theoretical resources at our disposal make this a really exciting time, in my view, to be a researcher into higher education. My arguments expand the range of questions rather than pretending that we have all the answers. Certainty has always struck me as the enemy of any form of intellectual inquiry. And pushing at boundaries and expanding our critical repertoire is an exhilarating project. We've started by asking some of the right questions, but there is much work to do. My insistence on theory, however, is not vainglorious. And while I'm not a relativist, I'm cautious about my own theoretical commitments and would endorse a plurality of approaches in what is a very young field. I think we're far too young to start waging paradigm wars. Val Hay describing academic commitments to this and that theory notes how often their own cherished analytical rationality is broken up by glimpses into the imagination of more provocative clinkers. I have come to the conclusion that it is not so much that we self-consciously assemble all the resources for the making of research imaginaries as those vivid ideas, and frequently their authors, come to haunt us. And in fact, in that quote, she was talking about the theorist Josephine Butler, who some of you will know. I certainly have multiple hauntings and associated intellectual vulnerabilities, and I'd encourage you to have them too. The danger of my argument for extending the boundaries of research into higher education is that it risks collapsing into a sort of grab-all theoretical eclecticism. But that, in my view, is a risk worth taking. The bigger danger is that if we stop asking questions that challenge us, and that we become complacent in the questions we ask about higher education. And with that complacency comes the danger of accepting other people's descriptions about the purposes of higher education and confining ourselves to research that pretends to tell us how to do things better. I don't believe we should confine ourselves to the research of questions, nor do I think it produces good research. And that, at its core, is why I believe we should be pushing the boundaries and engaging in critical research into higher education. And that is why I was absolutely delighted to be invited to speak at the opening of this conference. I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope it has every success over the next couple of days. Thank you.